Good morning, everybody. We are finishing up our autumn session. We just spent the last 2.5 days in extreme silence. A really short but really powerful session. It's really nice to sit with everybody and see everybody's dedication to this practice. And yeah, it's always really powerful experience having that intimacy with everybody. And so we're all kind of tired, and I feel like Stacen recently started a tradition of uh, end of session talks being really short, and I really like that tradition. Sorry, so Stacen wishes she could be here. I know she was supposed to speak today, but she just returned from a really long trip and is kind of decompressing and asked to have the day off. But she says hello and she misses everybody. And she will be back soon. So I didn't have much time to put too much together. So we'll just kind of have a quick talk here. And I was inspired by the fact that in 2 days it is election day. Midterms coming up. And my ballot's been sitting on my desk staring at me for a week or so now. And I personally am very motivated to vote. And so I've just been thinking a lot about politics, and I try to ask people whether they'll be voting. And I'd say more often than not, and often in the spiritual community, I hear a lot of people say, I'm not going to vote. It's all too depressing for me. It's all just lies and bullshit, and I try not to get involved in that stuff. I hear that a lot. And so I've just been thinking about that. And I was talking with someone the other day who was expressing that sentiment, and something came out of my mouth which I didn't necessarily think about. It just kind of like came to me, which is that voting is a spiritual experience. Politics is a spiritual endeavor. And obviously that's not like instinctual. I don't think many of our politicians turn to spirituality. In fact, we have a separation of church and state as one of the foundations, ostensibly a foundation of our democracy. But I don't know, I've just been sitting with that, how politics can be a spiritual experience. Voting a spiritual activity or duty even. And so I've just kind of like wanted to look into that, and did a little bit of research and exploring, what does Buddhism, what does the Buddha, what do spiritual teachers have to say about politics? And it's interesting, when I did the research, I found everything from articles saying, the Buddha and Buddhist teachings are all about moral governance and 100% about bringing the teachings and ideals of Buddhism to the governing stage. And I also found articles that said Buddhism is not political, and the Buddha didn't get involved in politics. And I found one article that said that the Buddha, for instance, never advocated for an end to the caste system. It took a while to convince him to bring women into the practice. He never advocated against disbanding armies. So those articles were kind of arguing that the Buddha really stayed out of the political arena. I took some notes here. So there's kind of this ambiguous findings if you research Buddhism and politics. And of course, the Buddha did on certain occasions get involved with leaders. And, I think there was at least one kind of war or battle that he tried to step in and like stop. And that's obviously kind of political. And obviously, things like equality, compassion, these are things that at least today we hold as ideals in politics. And there was this one article by James Shaheen, who is the editor of Tricycle. Tricycle is like a major, it's probably the biggest Buddhist periodical, at least in the Western world. And he said this interesting thing of how, no religion, no practice escapes the societal context in which it is. And he said this interesting thing about these ideals and ethics that we have of equality, anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-classism. Someone mentioned, borders, ending borders. There was a Buddhist who talked about Brexit being not a Buddhist thing because they're making more borders. And so this guy, James Shaheen, said that all of these ideals is actually us imposing our cultural ideals onto Buddhism. And if you look at the history of Buddhism, you find a lot of sexism, and you find a lot of border and boundary making. World War II, you find Buddhism getting very deeply involved in the war. And so to say that there's any kind of one politics of Buddhism, based on the ideals that we interpret today in our culture, it's kind of it's interesting how we impose our stuff on Buddhism, and it may not actually be so. This other article talks about how the Buddha was very clear that his teaching was about a personal virtue practice and about, as Dogen says, shining the light inward, with not so much emphasis on collective ideals or collective governance or anything like that. So, that was interesting to me to kind of see these two sides. Also, if we look at the Buddhist teaching of the relative and absolute that you hear us talk about all the time, those kind of say different things, right? So from an absolute perspective, where everything is one, the fact of emptiness, no separation, everything completely enlightened just as it is without any separation or concept, then there is no politics. And the idea of separating parties and votes and candidates and policies and legislation, that's all delusion. And that's very true. It's 100% true. And from that perspective, if we all just elect a bunch of bullies and we all just nuke each other, that is perfect Buddhahood. And all of us going up in flames and hating each other is Buddha. And I personally believe that 100%. Equally 100% true is our relative reality, right? They are both one, this relative and absolute. They meet like two arrows in midair, like we say in one of our sutras. And in the relative reality, all the particulars of life, all the ways we do separate, the candidates we vote for, the legislation we put in place, the policies we follow, really matter because they make suffering for others or alleviate suffering for others based on how we act. So There's no black and white, as I'm sure you're starting to get the theme of our practice here. And so then I stumbled upon a quote from the Buddha himself. Um, he said, "To force oneself to believe and accept a thing without understanding is political and not spiritual." To force oneself to believe and accept a thing without understanding is political and not spiritual, making a very clear distinction between politics and spirituality. And what that was just very like illuminating to me. And what it mainly illuminated was that politics meant something very different for the Buddha in his time, right? Politics was probably done amongst a select few. The messaging of politics back then was probably propaganda only. Most people probably had no access to understanding how policies were implemented. It was just, a very different caste system, monarchy kind of a thing. And how different our reality is now. Democracy, where basically everyone of age with a certain status of citizenship can vote, they can have their voices heard. Anyone with access to a library or a computer can learn a lot about what's going on and who's in power and how things are decided and how policies affect things. You can go look up every single piece of legislation in your local, state, and federal governments and look at every single word of that legislation. And so I wonder how the Buddha would feel differently, knowing that that is possible in politics. And the main thing that this quote inspired in me was, can we change that? Can we change this divide between spiritual and political? Can we bring our practice into the political realm, into governance? And I know that there's a lot of people, including Larry Ward, whose book we just finished in the study group we're in, are actively pursuing that and trying to bring meditation and introspection into the political realm, into, Congress, into campaigning. So this kind of inspires me to, like I was saying in the beginning, to make politics, to make voting, to make activism, advocacy, our spiritual duty. And it kind of reminds me of, let's see. Yeah, and because if we look, this propaganda that the Buddha is talking about, right? To believe and accept something without understanding is political. We do see that. We see a lot of people. We probably see most people just kind of accepting what they're told, creating little bubbles around them, right? The echo chamber, we all know about that. Watching the same TV, reading the same news, and really just kind of ignoring a fuller picture, a bigger picture. And I think we can change that, right? Just each individual, one little tiny step at a time, making a commitment to do what we can to understand, to go deeper into our lives, right? Politics, in a way, especially with a democracy, ostensibly a democracy, it affects our daily lives. It affects how our water is used. It affects how healthcare is distributed to people. It affects how wealth and resources are distributed. And any of us who take the Bodhisattva vow have to acknowledge that it's kind of our duty to take part in that. And So it kind of reminds me of a famous koan that I talk about a lot. Maybe you guys remember me talking about it, but the koan says it's like a buffalo passing through a lattice. Its head, horns, and legs all pass through. Why is it that its tail cannot? So you can picture a lattice is like what's behind me here, the little crisscrossy thing there. And so a buffalo passes through that. It's kind of a metaphor for passing through into emptiness, oneness, enlightenment, experiencing that absolute reality that we were talking about, the fact that everything is completely awakened and perfect just as it is. But the tail, that little bit, hangs on to delusion, hangs on to separation, to that relative reality. And why? Because that's our bodhisattva vow, to do what we can to alleviate suffering and to awaken others, to bring our practice and our spirituality to the world and to the people around us. Otherwise, we could just bliss out in nothingness and nothing gets done. No suffering, no cause of suffering, no alleviation of suffering. But in our lineage and in our, sect of Mahayana Buddhism, we really emphasize this bodhisattva vow and being of service and acting in the world with compassion. Our Dharma grandfather, Bernie Glassman, obviously made a huge example of his life in that. He dedicated himself to social action and being heavily involved in society. So, from that perspective of allowing our tails to remain attached to this relative reality, I really do think that it is our spiritual duty, our spiritual calling to get involved, to vote, to advocate, to learn, and to, as the Buddha said, understand what's going on. And how do we do this? How do we do this in the most awakened way possible without getting stuck in an echo chamber, without just being a talking piece for a rubber stamp for some kind of tribe or side? And I look to the three tenets that we always talk about, right? Bernie and the Zen peacemakers came up with this three tenets of enlightened action. And the three tenets are, of course, not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action. And so, I try to read news every day and stay abreast of everything going on and really try to look into all the local, state, and federal officials that are on the ballot and all that stuff. And how do we read that news? How do we read into it? First, come from a place of not knowing, right? So to the best of my ability, even though I may associate with one party throughout my life, to the best of my ability, really come to every issue, every candidate, every policy, everything, just empty, as if I had never heard Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, as if I didn't know any of the people, just totally blank slate. Get rid of all of my conditioning, all of my patterns, all of my assumptions and expectations, and just come completely open. And then from that place, bear witness. Bear witness to what I'm reading, bear witness to what I'm hearing, and just kind of openly, softly, lovingly, without judgment, without expectation, just absorb what's being said to me, what's being told, what's being expressed. And, bearing witness to when I might be being lied to, um, where I see contradictions, right? We do need to have a little bit of that wisdom, um, bearing witness to all sides, all possibilities. And so when someone says, I want to work for the working man, bear witness to that, but also bear witness to their private jet and their vote against allowing the working man to have health care, right? So it does take a lot of bearing witness to be sure, because we do have complex systems at work in how we receive information, to be sure. But to the best of my ability, to really come from a place of not knowing and to really just bear witness to everything I'm being shown. And then from that exercise, the loving action will just make itself clear. Um, and in this context today, that loving action is voting. And so I really hope, I'm going to continue. I still have a little more research to do on the large slate of judicial nominees we have and do the best I can. And, maybe after doing research and reading, maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know who's the best candidate, or whether I should allow blackjack to be happening in such and such a way. Um, and then maybe not voting, maybe, abstaining might be the most loving action at that time. But to the best of my ability, to take that loving action not from a place of us and them. We need to be the winners. They are always wrong. They want to make us miserable, and they're the villains and we're the heroes. Really trying to get rid of all of that. And that doesn't mean that I won't vote along the party lines, right? I assume that even after my open, not knowing, bearing witness, my loving action might be pretty one-sided. And that's just my karma, that's what I bring. But I really want to believe that other people with different karma in different situations can come from a place of not knowing, bear witness, and vote a different way. Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. It's difficult. It's difficult. But, obviously, as a church, we're not allowed to take any side or express any political opinion. But I do encourage everyone to see getting involved in governance, getting involved in the daily lives of our neighbors and our friends and our loved ones, insofar as we can, just a little bit, a little tiny voice that we have is truly the work of the Bodhisattva. So I encourage everyone to try to take some time before Tuesday to bring your practice and your wisdom and compassion to the political sphere. So thank you very much, and I'll open it up for any questions or comments or stump speeches.